Oh, diversity, diversity, diversity.
You have caused confusion.
Fascist moron.
Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about David Hockney's Bigger Splash, famous painting. And joining me, there is no one better qualified to talk about this. My old buddy, Mr. D. There he is. We're just hiding behind the painting. Say hello, Mr. D.
Hello, Mr. D. No, I'm very happy to be here. It's been a terrible interregnum, but no, back again, and of course doing my favorite thing. I mean, of course, all the wonderful moments on UO, but amongst my favorite moments were all the times I was privileged to join you on The Deepest Law and talk about Andy Warhol or decorating or the Muppets or all the things we talked about. My favorite thing is to just talk about art endlessly, and I don't get an enormous opportunity to do that because, of course, most people most people don't care. So it's wonderful to actually be back and talking to you again, my old friend, but also to talk about art.
Well, I mean, recently I've been doing these Friday culture shows, D, and recently I've been looking at what I've been calling vernacular British culture, which is kind of popular low art, things like the Beano comics, Carry On films, Enid Blyton books, things like that. And I thought David Hockney is an interesting person to think about because he belongs to I guess what you'd call the high art world, or he belongs to a different cultural register, and yet, in a way, he's bringing something of a different world into that world. Looking at this, I mean, in his time, for example, I believe that Hockney had some controversy due to the kind of topics he chose to focus on and, where he was positioned. Does he count as pop art, D? Is that?
Oh, no, absolutely. And in fact, of course, probably a topic for another stream, but pop art, there is I would say there is good argument to suggest that pop art actually originated simultaneously in America and in Britain. So, I mean, for instance, one of the earliest pieces of kind of proto or kind of pop art is the British artist Richard Hamilton, who made a collage called "What Makes Today's Homes So Different, So Appealing," and it's a very famous work of art. But basically, it's a collage, consisting of images that he clipped out of popular magazines and comics and adverts and such. I mean, people will probably know it. I mean, if you know anything about art, and Richard Hamilton, and there were many other artists. Peter Blake is an artist that people may know because probably know they will know him mostly because of his collaboration with Beatles. Richard Hamilton also collaborated with Beatles. The kind of photo collage which was part of the interior wrapping of the Beatles' White Album was made by Richard Hamilton.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and so oddly enough, I mean, as much as pop art is associated with America, it was also a British innovation and very early British innovation, which is why I think Hockney is so interesting because he's an artist who also basically spanned both worlds, and of course his career. I mean, he's still living. He's quite old now, but he has now been alive long enough where his work has both kind of recrossed the kind of physical and cultural seas, because of course he's had, I mean, this work that we're going to talk about, Bigger Splash, and some of his work from the middle later 1960s, is very much a kind of a kind of British an outsider British view of American sort of American manifestations of culture in the late 1960s. But of course, he's also well known because later on, I mean, in the even as late as after the 2010s, he sort of reinvented himself by doing a whole series of landscape paintings of the British countryside, including, of course, his own childhood digs in the north, and he did many paintings of, again, I mean, in his various inimitable styles and formats, but sort of became a kind of traditional British landscape painter again. So a very interesting character again, who sort of dipped in and out of what we call pop art and of course older forms of British expression.
Do you think it's fair to say that some element of pop art was interested in bringing that, or I mean, what I'm calling a kind of vernacular low culture or popular culture into the art world, or into the artwork? I mean, this is something that Andy Warhol did a lot. Richard Hamilton, his actual materials were the stuff of low culture, magazines, comics, like you said. With this work, A Bigger Splash, which I've always liked, I've always been a fan of this. Is it fair to say that Hockney at this time in his career was interested in the various ways in which the British imagination had been captured by America, or in this moment after World War II, it's like people were looking to America. Their dreams had become American. Is this what this painting is trying to say, Dee?
There's certainly an aspect of that. I don't know if you can find the image of Hockney from 1963 with Warhol and Henry Geldzahler and Jeff Goodman. I mean, it's in. Yeah, there we go. So again, this is 1963. This is, so you can see David Hockney, third from the left. Warhol, hilariously, of course, with a cigarette in his mouth. Warhol never smoked, but it's part of the pastiche. But this is a fairly young Hockney coming to America as he did. So I would say that the interesting thing about Hockney is that his sensibilities were quintessentially British. Again, I mean, he was a man who was interested in kind of literary illusions early in his career. He was interested, of course, the landscape, the kind of the country house, the interior, the still life. I mean, all these things that had been, at various points in art history, being associated with British art. And yet, of course, I believe you're right in a way, is that he felt this pull towards America. I mean, this idea that the kind of American vernacular culture that had developed, from the late 1940s, the 1950s, especially in the early 1960s, is that it was weirdly alluring. It was this idea. I mean, now, of course, we associate the kind of consequences of that culture with sort of materialism, with kind of globalist corporations. We associate this with kind of hollowing out of kind of religion or meaning or culture. But I mean, there was this time, certainly in the late 50s and early 1960s, again, the time when David Hockney first as a young man traveled to America and try to meet up with the kind of American exemplars of theirs, was very interested in this idea, that this new idea that was presented by America, where it was kind of a leveling out. It was not so much this idea of kind of being subsumed by all the kind of terrible aspects of materialism, but it was this sort of exciting moment where, it's difficult to say. Again, if you look at the kind of threads that led into British mod, so people may know the kind of mod culture, that of course turned into kind of the King's Road, that turned into kind of
like Bryson Rock, stuff like that kind of stuff.
Exactly, yes, and that of course eventually, fed into the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and the British invasion. I mean, this kind of cross pollination where we said, okay, we're sort of like lifted above, the kind of rusted chains of the Victorian imagination, the rusted sort of kind of ideas of the American Empire prior to the two wars. All of these things are kind of now ossified or broken, and we've got to find a kind of perhaps way to join in a new culture. It sounds entirely naive now because we've seen where it led. But I mean, at a time, again, as always with young, generations of young men, they will try to find their own kind of path away from these things. Whatever you say about the post-war settlement, I think for young people at that period, and of course, none of these were boomers. These were not boomers. David Hockney is not a boomer. He's older than that. Warhol was certainly not a boomer. The Beatles were not boomers. I mean, these were people who belonged to the silent gen, yes. And of course, they saw they had a toe in. They understood the basically the kind of fag end of British culture, because of course after World War II, the British state was absolutely decimated. The British aristocracy was broken and deracinated. I mean, all of these things had ended far before, of course, the deprivations and horrors of World War II rolled in. So
you think
it was these men trying to find another path. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, D. I think it's fair to say that their optimism and the optimism of that moment was genuine, and there is something infectious about it. I was also going to say that if you ever look at any footage of Britain in that post-war period, I'm thinking of like British New Wave cinema, some of the kitchen sink stuff. There is a claustrophobia about it. It's kind of closed spaces, and there's a feeling of being kind of trapped in those little streets and those Victorian houses. And one of the things that if you look at this painting, it's the big wide open blue space, the unlimited horizon beyond it. You couldn't get further away from like dingy, industrial Liverpool in like 1950 than this. You know?
I mean, yeah. Keep in mind, of course, Hockney was born in Bradford. Like, he was born in. I'm going to guess. I think it's 1937, 36, 37, something like that. Imagine being born in Bradford in 1937, of course, as World War II is, of course, looming overhead. After, of course, the terrible things that happened during World War I, as I said, to the British aristocracy, the British state, the British people, all these deprivations, which would only become worse. Of course, you're born in 1937, and you grow up. By the time you're a teenager, you're in the early 1950s. Of course, rationing is still going on. And again, imagine what that would have been like. Someone like Hockney, again, a Yorkshire lad, at heart, and so again, you would see how this kind of image that America was putting forth. Of course, we know it's false, and I think, of course, a lot of the artists that I admire so much from that period, like Warhol and like Hockney, they also knew that there was something terribly dark behind it. I mean, if people want to, to review those old streams we did on your Deepest Lore with Andy Warhol, those 8 epic streams. But I think I posited the case that Warhol, of course, had an entirely nihilistic vision of what all of this meant. That there is this idea, I suppose, amongst some of the pop artists, that pop art was kind of optimistic. But I think that certainly for Warhol, and some of the other American artists, and I think even for Hockney, I mean, he understood that this was a facade. That this was it was a beautiful vision of a kind of far-flung utopia. Again, imagine a lad born in Bradford in 1937. Imagine his imaginations of what is the West Coast America? What is it to live in California? What is a swimming pool? Like, what are these kind of signifiers of post-war opulence, that would come to dominate the media? Mm-hmm. So I do think that for Hockney, I mean, even these works, I mean, they were both kind of a celebration of this culture of escape, which certainly post-war America was, but also an acknowledgement that these were also sterile and empty visions, ultimately denuded of human contact. These are things we will certainly talk about in a moment with this picture. So I would say that it's kind of weird position of being a both celebratory, but also a kind of Cassandra crying at the edges, saying that this of course is not gonna help you. It's not gonna save you.
Now I've come to look at this picture for as long as we have. It's probably the longest of a single moment that I've looked at this painting. There is something kind of the quality of a film set. There's something flat about this building, and the chair there. Obviously, it's a pool chair or deck chair or something, but it could be a director's chair. And if you could just imagine pushing that building, you can imagine it being paper thin or cardboard thin. It's not actually real. It's just a set. It's just fake,
Yep.
And there is that element there, which I hadn't really quite. I'd always taken this at face value, this painting, and just saw it as a building. But I guess you could see it as like flat pack cardboard set scenery,
And it is entirely, certainly in its visual conception. So, and of course, I think that one of the kind of primary things that we that I think that is addressed with this is that this is a contrast between violent motion. Of course, we see the splash, we see all the tendrils, which of course Hockney famously reveled in the fact that it took him 2 weeks to paint the kind of product of 2 seconds. Like what is the moment of a human body diving into a pool? I mean, we've got this sort of violent image in the lower third of this painting. We see these tendrils of water, these drops, these splashes, all of this, and the painting is called The Biggest Splash. But most of the painting, almost everything else in the painting, of course, as you say, the building, the trees, the sky, the chair, the foot, the kind of diving board, everything is absolutely static. There is nothing. There is no life. There is no movement. There is no breeze. There is nothing else in this. It is entirely static image except for that splash. And of course, we ask ourselves, well, the splash is the result of a body, a living body, possibly in a bikini or a bathing suit, a desirable man, a desirable woman, a kind of living, breathing human. But yet we don't see that. That's hidden from us. It's only represented by this break in the stillness, by this splash.
This could be autism on my part, D, but as long as I've been a fan of this painting, and in fact I used to have alongside my Nighthawks at dinner, that that kind of thing, Hopper. I used to have a reprint of this on my office wall. So if a student came in, they'd be confronted with these 2 paintings, and this was one of them. In all the years I've liked this painting, it has never occurred to me that a human being created the splash. I have never. Really? This is the first time I thought, "Oh, there's a person there." It just never occurred to me. It never occurred to me. So,
wow.
Which probably speaks to the sterility of the rest of it, because it's just like I don't know what in my mind created the splash, but I never thought, "Oh, there's a real person who just dived in I never drew that connection. So
Well,
anyway,
it's very, very interesting. Yes, because of course, I mean, nothing else in this painting suggests life or movement or vitality, whatever. I mean, you've got this splash, which is of course the remnant. You know, I mean, or the residue. You can talk about human residues. You can talk about remnants. You can talk about the after effects. But yes, I mean, there is a body. Presumably, there is a body hidden from us this what we see, this abstract, this splash of paint, these tendrils, whatever. This is the residue of a living body breaking the stillness of this entire scene. You know, and of course, who they are, why they've done this, where they will emerge, or if they will emerge. You know, none of this is given to us, and I would say that we're even further distanced from this by, of course, the fact that you will notice that this painting has a very large border of a kind of cream-colored blankness when nothing is happening. You know, oh, what is that? I mean, why has he done this? Why has he not framed this painting right up to the edge of the scene? Well, again, it may be a bit of an antique reference to younger people, but of course, when there was a type of photography, I mean, there was emulsion photography. There was also the Polaroid land camera, which, and then later on we got the SX70. There were other Polaroid formats that came after this. But again, this is almost sort of conjures up the idea of not only are we're not really looking at a scene, we're looking at a depiction of a photograph of a scene. Like, he has removed us to the point where he's put this border, again, for the time, 1967, this would be understood as a kind of border of a photograph. You know, he has pushed us away. We're not even there. We're not even beside the swimming pool. We are in some meta space looking at a photograph of a swimming pool at some time in the future where a person has just pierced the water, and yet we will never know because, of course, we are separated from it by time and by media. You know, and this is something, of course, that comes up. I mean, you know, if you think about the work of Andy Warhol, always mediated by photography. You know, there is never a sense in any of Warhol's work that you are directly engaging with the subject. You're always removed from the subject. I mean, even in some of the other American pop artists, you know, or Richard Hamilton. Again, a collage. You're not looking at a scene. You're looking at a scene pieced together from simulations of a scene. Roy Lichtenstein. You're not looking at whatever he's painting. You're looking at a kind of comic book interpretation. You're removed from that scene. And of course, I would say that this is part of the kind of postmodern condition that was present in the most intelligent of pop art. And again, Hockney has given you a frame. He has framed this painting in a way that will forever distance you even further from this splash. You're never going to get hit by the water from this splash because, of course, it happened before you had any knowledge of it, and of course, you will forever after be separated from it by the frame of a photograph, you know, of a moment captured by someone in the midst of time.
Now, how old? This is a picture of Hockney in '67. He was just 30 years old when he painted this, right?
Yeah. And this is the year. This is the year that he painted Biggest Splash was 67. This picture, I believe that this was taken in London, but I am not entirely sure of the provenance. Biggest Splash was actually painted in America. It was not painted in Britain. He was invited to teach at the University of what's it called, Berkeley, in California in 1967, and I believe between April and June of 1967, while he was in Berkeley, California, he painted A Bigger Splash. But this is the same year, but I believe this may be in London. I'm not entirely sure, but yes, I mean he was a fairly young man. I mean, the thing that leads me to believe it's London is that you can see on his palette. I don't know if you can go back. Yeah, you see on his palette he is using a Heinz baked
Yeah, you can't get baked
tin.
beans in New York in
You
1967.
yeah, no, you can't get Heinz beans like in that tin. So I sense that this is, but it's the same year. I've got another
He's
image.
been
I don't know.
he's been to Coney Island as well.
He's been to Coney Island. Well, again, because Hockney, I mean, famously amongst British artists, he was very proud of this kind of his sort of détente with America. You know, there is a passage in one of Andy Warhol's memoirs of the '60s, which is called Popism, where he talks about David Hockney coming to New York to buy like flamboyantly colored socks, because of course you couldn't get them in Britain, you know, in 1963, 1964. So Hockney would come to America. He would load up, you know, bleaching his hair. He would load up on all these, again, kind of signifiers of visiting America, which was quite quite a luxury at that time in Britain. Yeah, but I remember that thing about Hockney coming to New York to buy neon colored socks.
Have you been to Coney Island? It's creepy as hell. I've been.
I have been. I've ridden on the Cyclone, which is a roller coaster. I'm a big fan of roller coaster. Yeah, I mean, it's creepy as hell.
Kind of weird clown, 30s clown, but it's kind of like edgy. I don't know, like that area seems edgy as well. I had a Nathan hot dog there as well.
Yeah, I also had Nathan hot dog because they're still located there. So the first time, I think probably the first and last time I visited there was like 1995. So it was a very long time ago. And I remember, I mean, I don't know what's going on there now, but there was a very weird, because a lot of these surrounding areas were Russian immigrants. Like I just remember there was a lot of Russians, and then there was Coney Island, which of course has its own kind of cachet. But yeah, it's a very weird place. I mean, it has that vibe of kind of the deserted seaside.
I went there about 15 years after that, maybe even 16 years after you. And wow, the people there were not Russian. I'll just tell you that.
They weren't Russian. Okay.
They were. They may have been migrants from the Bronx or Brooklyn, or the people who used to live in those areas that have been gentrified out. You know.
Okay, it was weird. I mean, around that area. Trying to remember. I just remember there being a lot of Russians. Also, I remember that there's a bit in. I must admit to a guilty pleasure of enjoying early Woody Allen films. You know, because I'm very interested in, of course, the kind of New York culture, you know, in the 70s and 80s and that. But I believe in his, of course, one of his most famous films, Annie Hall, he posits a fictional childhood where he lived under a roller coaster in Coney Island, like his family.
Yes, with Christopher Walken living there.
Christopher Walken, was Annie Hall's brother.
Annie Hall's brother.
But I remember, so in '95 when I went there, that roller coaster, which was used in the film, which had the house under it, was still standing. It was deserted. It was falling down. Of course, I think it was very, very soon after was raised. But yeah, I mean, it was all there. But see, the thing is, I mean, one of the weird things about about you and me, AA, is we discovered that we have a lot of common interests. You know, like you know the kind of the Margulies, American Broadside thing, kind of pop art. You know, Bowie, Dylan. You know, all of these things. But you know, I mean, I've been fascinated by this since I saw these pictures. And so, I mean, people should remember Bigger Splash by David Hockney is in the Tate in London. It was it was sold. It was sold to Tate in, I believe, 1981, and I would have seen it probably in the mid 1980s. So I saw this. I saw Warhol. I saw Roy Lichtenstein. I saw these things as a young man. I saw, of course, Turner and all the other things, and Titian and all these other artists. But I did also see these things, and you know, so again, for me, these sort of awakened a kind of deep interest in this strange cross-continental, you know, sort of cultural exchange that happened with pop art. So I've been interested in this most of my life, and been aware of it most of my life.
So there's two things, in the interest of time, D, there's two things I want to mention before we finish, or two things I want us to discuss before we finish up on Bigger Splash. The first thing is this painting a sequel? Because he also has a painting which is just called The Splash, right?
Yes,
from a year previous. This one
I've included, The Splash. It is. In fact, there's another work called The Little Splash, which I didn't have a good copy of. So if you compare them, I mean, you can see that all the kind of elements are in place, and yet, you know, it's a slightly different work. You know, I mean, the Splash, which you see from 1966, the year prior to Bigger Splash, it's not quite as static. You know, that house, which of course is a slightly an older house. You know, that the house in Bigger Splash is pure kind of modern. This house is modern, but you know, there's a little
seems
bit
old.
More
seems older.
It's older. Well, and so of course the reason it seems older is that so these paintings, both the Bigger Splash and this one, they were not painted like Hockney didn't go to a house in California to a swimming pool. They were based upon various images that he saw. I know that this painting, the Splash, the early one, was based on a technical manual about constructing swimming pools, which is called, I've got the source, Swimming Pools by Sunset Books, published in 1959. And so the photograph upon which he based his composition was from that book. Again, it's basically 1959. Of course, the architecture is much more in keeping with the kind of an older modern aesthetic. But the Bigger Splash, of course, he took this idea and he sort of expanded it. He hollowed it out in a way. You know, he made the kind of the house and landscape a bit more kind of blank. He included, of course, the chair. Again, the chair alluding to a kind of absent person. You know, so yes, I mean, this is the Bigger Splash is a sequel. The color palette is slightly different.
Is it more highly regarded? Do you think it's fair to say that the Bigger Splash is the more famous and more critically rated painting?
Absolutely, a much more historically important important painting. I mean, so keep in mind, of course, the Splash and the kind of precedents for the Bigger Splash are still in private collections. The Splash, interesting enough, again, if you could have a time machine, the Splash sold at Sotheby's in London in 2006 for £2.9 million.
Right.
And then it sold in 2020 at Sotheby's in London for £23,117,800,000. So again, and Hockney's prices,
even with inflation, that's pretty good.
It's very good. I mean, Hockney's prices, I mean, he's always been fairly highly regarded, but his prices went ballistic, I would say, during the 2010s and especially the 2020s. So yeah, I mean, but the thing about this is, of course, a lot of these early works are very sought after because very few of them are in private hands. You know, The splash being that's as close as anyone's going to get, because the biggest splash again will be the property of the Tate forever until the Tate dissolves, whatever. But
Right.
so hence the
Or
high price.
until they declared David Hockney a white supremacist or some nonsense.
Until they declared David, and it may happen. I mean, David Hockney is despite being a northerner and being a Labour Party aficionado for years, he's also very based in other ways. But people can look that up. But I included a couple of earlier images. If you want to look, Hockney, California, Hockney, Hollywood Pool. So that's 1965. It's oil on canvas. This is a drawing from 1965. I mean, these are again temporally close to these series of swimming pools. Hockney was weirdly interested in swimming pools from the mid 1960s until really the late 70s. I mean, he continued to produce kind of various works about pools. I mean, you see this one you've got here. 1965, called California. I mean, this is in private hands, but again, he is, Hockney was always an open homosexual. I mean, part of his kind of cachet, again, aside from the kind of cross-cultural American interest, but also he was never, even from his earliest works, people can look up that he did a painting while he was still in school called "We Two Boys Together Clinging." Again, a kind of famously proto-homosexual statement, and all of these pictures are as well. But again, I think the crucial bit is that he took a step back. I mean, as with these earlier paintings, you see he's been very explicit. We see the body in the pool. I mean, we get the kind of static image of the kind of poolside and whatever. But again, we are still privileged by seeing the carnal body, the living human flesh in the pool. And I think the very crucial step was him realizing that was not the important bit. The important bit, again, was this moment between, I mean, almost a kind of T.S. Eliot moment, between the incarnation and the action, between the flesh and the disappearance, lies the shadow, if people remember Your Wasteland. And I think, of course, the more interesting bit he realized after these images was not so much the kind of pin-up men in the pool, but it was this kind of ambiguity between someone leaping and the water stilling again.
Couldn't help but notice, D, as well, that another huge thing that changes is the he goes off the idea of the shining of the water. Look, the water is completely one color, flat in Bigger Splash and in Splash indeed.
Yeah.
Whereas here, he's got all these, he's trying to give different shimmers or different light on the water. It goes off that idea.
He's still concerned with the optical effects of the water. Whereas, of course, the Little Splash, the Splash, and the Bigger Splash, they're not really about water at all. They're about paint. They're about paint. They're about an image. It's not about the optical effect of water. Now, he would return in kind of later compositions. I mean, there are things he did in the 1970s which were sort of explorations of kind of cast paper sort of images of swimming pools, but they were much more concerned, again, back to the optical effects of the water. But again, I think the crucial bit about these splash paintings from 66 to 67 was the fact that he understood that it was not about light, it was not about depiction, it was not about the water, it was about the representation of a kind of liminal moment between action and stillness. And I think that again, I would say that that's what makes these paintings so important. I mean, at any time you look at a sort of great work of art, it's always going to present itself to you as a kind of mystery, as a kind of thing that you can't quite figure out. Why is this different from these other images, from these other kind of ideas that he was working with? Why is this not really a kind of painting of a swimming pool? Why is this a painting of something else? Why is this a painting of action and stillness? Why is this a painting of pain? And to kind of extend, if people want to think about this in a different way, we won't cover it explicitly, but I tweet out art. I tweet paintings and art fairly frequently on my Twitter account. And I think last year, you remember, another series that I was very happy to participate in on your Deepest Law was about Francis Bacon with my friend Alexander Adams. We did multi-part stream about Bacon, but Bacon did a picture in the late 1970s, early 1980s called A Jet of Water. And again, I invite people, to consider. I think that Bacon was very explicitly thinking about Hockney and trying to kind of consider what Hockney did in these splash paintings, and especially in A Bigger Splash, and trying to kind of reconcile it with his own work. So again, I would suggest that there is a deep connection between this picture, the kind of philosophical implications that Hockney was making, and of course things that Francis Bacon did 20 years or 15 years later. So
last thing I want to mention, Dee, before we get out of here, because it would be remiss not to, is that we were talking about this as an exciting cultural moment in the late 1960s, on also this kind of Britain meets America, or something exciting happening. It would be remiss of me not to mention that in the year this painting was composed by Hockney, all of these albums came out. Are You Experienced by Jimi Hendrix, Velvet Underground, Axis Boulder's Love, Something Else by the Kinks, Buffalo Springfield Again, Magical Mystery Tour, their Satanic Majesty's Request, Wild Honey by the Beach Boys, Safe as Milk by Beefheart, Between the Buttons, John Wesley Harding, The Doors, and Strange Days, both by The Doors, Surrealistic Pillow, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, Forever Changes Love. I mean, The Who Sell Out, Songs of Leonard Cohen. I mean, these are Procol Harum. These are all-time. Mellow Yellow by Donovan, Grateful Dead's first album. Tim Hardin 2 is a great album. I mean, this was a moment. Chelsea Girl by Nico, Jefferson Airplane. I mean,
Chelsea Girl, Absolutely Free by the Mothers of Invention,
Sergeant Pepper.
Sergeant Pepper. Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you mentioned, the Velvet Underground and Nico with Andy Warhol's. I mean, Andy Warhol paid for that record. No, I think you're right. I mean, this was an amazing cultural moment. I think a lot of people dismiss, amongst all, again, proximate political squabbles about things. We hate the boomers, but I mean, this was a absolute cultural watershed. Very, very important things, and saying very important things. And whatever you feel about the kind of proximate culture that produced these things, I mean, these years 65, 66, 67, 68 were incredibly important culturally, and you will be remiss to ignore all of this. And I would say the very interesting thing about David Hockney is unlike some of these people, he is a man who is still living. He has lived through all of these years. He experienced those things. He experienced, of course, things after his work changed in drastic ways. And it is absolutely something that people should not forget and should consider. A great moment, an absolutely great moment. Slightly before my time, but of course became important to me. As so many people my generation. Yeah, I mean,
I feel that both of us lived in the shadow of this moment. My entire life certainly
Yeah.
has been in the shadow of this moment of 67, 68, 69.
Yeah.
And in a strange way, it had a very long hangover, which we discussed when we did our long David Bowie streams as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just do think it's worth noting that the context for this is extraordinary. Any one of those albums we just mentioned, by the way, if it was released today, would be easily the best album released this year. You know,
Oh,
yet
by
in
far.
1967, they're struggling to meet the top 20. You know, it really is incredible. All right, Dee, well,
indeed, and again, I would suggest to people, again, if you dismiss this period, I mean, you should look at this amazing and strange period. I mean, I would say that this moment, from the early 60s until the end of the 60s, it's especially the kind of what happened between Britain and America, I think was extraordinarily important, because both places learned from each other. Of course, I mean, we think of the quote British invasion. We think of how much kind of Delta blues and kind of earlier American forms influenced the kind of the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, even people like Jethro Tull, the Led Zeppelin, and then of course how the kind of British cross-cultural currents influence America. Again, whatever you feel about the politics of this period, this was an absolutely brilliant cultural watershed, and this was a wonderful moment. I wish it could happen again. I am not ashamed to admit, if I could go back, I'm not going to go back to the fucking 90s. I'm gonna go back to I'm gonna go back to 1965, because I would love to live through this. It was a terrible moment, of course, because again, it was the beginning of all of these things that we see bearing ill fruit. But it was also a wonderful moment. And again, you can find the good bits if you look into art, culture, music, all of these things.
But probably the best way to measure this is to think about how little the culture has changed. It's 2024 now, as we're recording this. You could go back to the year 2000 and still find stuff like X Factor on TV. You can go back 20 years and the culture has changed very little. It's still X Factor. It's still that horrible R&B Beyonce thing, Taylor Swift and all. Like, so little has changed in the past 20 years. Whereas if you compare 1967 to 1947, it's like
47, 57, 77. Yeah, I mean, the leap. I mean, even in my lifetime, I mean, I remember the 80s. I remember the 90s. I remember the 2000s. Very different times. But yeah, I mean, and there, of course, there are people who've written about this. The fact that culture stuck, in the late 2000s, and of course has never moved again. And the kind of why that happened, of course, is a good question. But I do think there is something to that. You would, again, if you went from 1947 to 1957, or 1957 to 67, or 67 to 77, you would not recognize it. I mean, you would feel out of time. But if you went from 2010 to 2020, you're right, or even our moment, and of course, I do feel that one of the things, whatever we think of our quote movement, I think one of the most important things is to remember that the things that last, the things that persist, the things that we love, the things that give us hope. I mean, I look back on all this wonderful work, this wonderful music, this wonderful artwork, and it gives me a reason to live. It gives me a reason for hope. It gives me a kind of wonder of humanity. And of course, I would say the most important thing is we've got to revive this. We've got to make our culture, we've got to make things vital again as they were in these times or earlier times. So I would say that there is a lesson to be learned. There is a lesson to be learned, even if you don't understand, even if you're not terribly. This is not your style. This is not something you appreciate. I think there is a larger lesson to be learned from these wonderful works.
Well, fantastic. Now, just before we sign off here, Dee, you were talking before we came on air about your new was it Buy Me a Coffee link? Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. I mean, after all these years, I have monetized by itself. So
It's about time.
it's about time. I mean, besides, it's like I don't need it. And then finally, at a point, you're like, well, I don't care if I don't need it. I need it now. It's 2024. I need it now. Kamala Harris is about to bleed me dry. Listen. So yes. So if people are interested, if you enjoyed my appearances on all of those Deepest Laws or UO or even now, I mean, I also can't say how happy I am to be back. I absolutely love talking to you, and I think you and I have a weirdly deep current together. We share admiration for a lot of things, which is wonderful. So it's very good to be back. So if people want to support me, certainly you should support AA. But also, if you want to support me, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/John D. But it's spelled IOHNDEE. That's buymeacoffee.com/John D. IOHNDE. I mean, just as my Twitter handle is spelled. And you can buy me 1 or 2 or 5 or however many copies you like, and I will be very happy. But I also should express how wonderful it is to talk to you again, and thank you for having me back, AA.
Yeah, been a pleasure, Dee, and I'll drop that in the show notes so people can have it. All right, fantastic. And well, if people like this, maybe we can do it again sometime. But time for everybody to get out. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. You can join the channel for thousands of hours of past shows in the archive and hundreds of videos. If you have any questions, you can leave a super chat or a super thanks, and I'll be sure to pick it up during my weekly office hours, which run every Tuesday afternoon. I also provide courses at the academic agency, which I encourage people to buy. Thousands of students now have taken the Trivium to improve their skills in writing, logic, and rhetoric. Just 3 of many courses available. Buy it now. But most importantly of all, friends, get out.